My name's Phil Harrison. I've been doing some of the lectures for groups 15 to 18, and they've just decided to let me out in the afternoon as well to do something, so here I am. You've probably guessed the title of this lecture, Babies and Chinchillas. While this is slightly, doesn't tell you a great deal about the subject matter, you've probably guessed that it doesn't involve much zoology and does involve quite a lot of language acquisition specifically. And we are here talking first language acquisition. We've all, certainly all of you, and myself as well, have struggled to a greater or lesser extent with the vagaries of a foreign language. And we know how difficult it can be to make the conscious effort to acquire a second language in adulthood. And maybe sometimes we've been rather envious of the ease with which we acquired our native language. If we could think back how we did that, then that would be quite an interesting thing to find out. And it's certainly true that the acquisition of a first language in childhood is quite a different ballgame from the kinds of mental acrobatics that we've all been through as grown-ups. Learnability has been a burning issue and one of the central issues in linguistics since linguistics was an issue at all. And it no less applies to the acquisition of phonology than it does to the acquisition of any other aspects of a grammar, to syntax or anything else. Somehow we acquire the phonological repertoire and the phonetic realizations of that repertoire of our own native language at an early age. And furthermore, our perception runs ahead of this to a certain extent. Things happen in our perceptual abilities even before we emerge into the world. It's been demonstrated that in the last 3 months of pregnancy, that a baby is in fact tuned in to the intonational patterns of its own native language. And certainly by 4 days of age, a baby can tell its mother's voice from anybody else's. These precocious abilities have been spotted by psychologists and psycholinguists, but not much has been said about how you align these precocious abilities with the mature cognitive system, with the eventual design system of the sounds that underlie the language. And what I want to do this afternoon is to discuss a couple of ideas which might build a few bridges in that area, which might link psychoacoustics with phonology via this thing called phonetics, so that we can get from a purely perceptual ability to a cognitive ability, something psychological, which has reality only as a mental abstraction. What we're really doing is looking for some kind of asymmetries in the acquisition of phonetics or phonology, which can be accounted for by using phonological theory to analyze the acquisitional process. First of all, I want to run through some tales of precocity in infancy to just give you the lowdown on what's already been found out about perceptual acquisition, and then make a couple of suggestions as to how we could use these tales in our phonological experimentation. If we're talking perception, then we have to understand what sort of perceptual processes that we encounter both in infancy and in adulthood. And if we look first at the perception of stop consonants, of plosive consonants, then quite a lot of work has been done for many years in trying to understand how it is that we tell the difference between one plosive consonant and another. The perceptual routine for stop consonants appears to be categorical. So categorical perception simply means the imposition of a linguistic boundary between two categories at a value which is scientifically arbitrary. The graph on the OHP shows what is known as a labeling function. Now this is a graph of responses made by an adult speaker of English, in this case me, to stimuli which might either be the k sound at the beginning of coat or the g sound at the beginning of goat. Now you can see that we can vary the VOT, the voice onset time. That's the length of time between the release of the plosive and the onset of vocal fold vibration. We can vary this scientifically. So we can increase it from 0 by a definite amount of milliseconds, and we can decrease it. We can start the vocal folds vibrating before we release the plosive. And you can see that for any value less than about 20 milliseconds of VOT, I will perceive the g sound, and for any value higher than 20 milliseconds, I will inevitably perceive the k sound. There's nothing special about 20 milliseconds VOT. This is a linguistic categorization which is imposed on a scientifically arbitrary value. And this is common, this is not just a freak of my own brain, this is common for English speakers generally. Categorical perception of stops is the way that we do it. The interesting thing from our point of view is that not only that we do it that way, but so does he. Or people even younger than him, probably. He's cute, so you can have a look at him while I drone on here about infant perception. It appears that by 1 month of age, that English acquiring infants can do this very trick. They can categorically perceive the difference between the consonants at the beginning of pin and the consonants at the beginning of bin. This has been known for around about 20 years now, or even 25 years, even longer than that. And we thought at one stage that this was very exciting news because it meant that we had innate linguistic perception, that at birth almost we could tell these categorical differences. 4 years later than these experiments, in 1975, it was demonstrated that this little fellow, which is a chinchilla, could do the same trick. He would leap across a cage to get some food when he heard the difference between pin and bin. So it appeared that not only English speakers, but also chinchillas could perform the same trick. Now, if that's the case, then this perception is not linguistic as such, since, as far as we know, chinchillas do not develop the English language. Moving on a little further in time to some experiments that took place in 1979, at that stage there was a cross-linguistic experiment carried out on English and Spanish infants at the age this time of 6 months, a little older in life. And these experiments showed that not only could that the English infants at 6 months could actually perceive the English VOT boundary. This isn't particularly amazing because we already knew that they could at 1 month of age. But what we have to bear in mind is that in the English and Spanish languages, the VOT boundary is placed at a different point in the VOT continuum. So here you have a representation of the point in the VOT continuum where the boundary is placed. For the Spanish speaker, it is around 0 milliseconds of VOT, and for the English speaker, it's about 25 or so. The English infants perceive this boundary as you might predict. The interesting thing about the Spanish infants is that they perceive this boundary and this boundary. They could tell a change in category at both of those places. You wouldn't, of course, want to say that this is because the English are lousy at learning foreign languages. I'm sure, would you? But a better answer may be that the language faculty may or may not use some kind of endowed mammalian perceptual routine to develop language. We find the same kind of story if we turn to the perception of vowels. Now, the perception of vowels takes place via a different kind of routine. When we perceive a vowel, we perceive some kind of a prototype. Now, let's start with the acoustics of vowels. The acoustic perception of vowels depends on the position of formants. These are frequency peaks in the acoustic signal. So if I take the sound of a vowel and I slice through it and I graph the frequency or the pitch of the signal along the bottom axis, and the axis and the intensity or the loudness of the side, then you can see that there are peaks of frequency at certain places which are quite independent of the pitch of the signal. If they weren't, then we wouldn't be able to sing vowels on the same note. We can sing ah and we can sing oo on the same note. And that's because the formants differ. The pitch of the vowel, of course, remains exactly the same. The first two of these formants, the lowest two in the acoustic signal, are the most important for the perception of vowels. Now, if we take these values for F1 and F2, this is the values for R, this is the values for E, and this is the values for OO, and you can see that they're quite different. If we take these values and plot them against each other on a graph, and perform a verification test using adult speakers of a language, we can see that at a certain value, we feel that this is the right kind of acoustic value to give us the perception of a certain vowel. And the further that we depart from the central value here, the less good a token of the vowel it becomes. Moving back to our stories of infants now, we need to find out whether infants at 6 months, having demonstrated that they can do certain perceptual jobs on stops, we want to see if they can do these kinds of jobs on vowels. And one way of doing this would be to play them values of F1 graphed against F2 and see if they can hear the difference. The reason, one interesting aspect of the adult perception of these values is that our acoustic ability to distinguish one of these from the other gets worse towards the center of the scale. So something interferes with our acoustic perception once we start using it for linguistic purposes, and we become less good at distinguishing the values towards the center. So Patricia Kuhl and her colleagues, who carried out many of these experiments, synthesized tokens of two different vowels. One was a prototype of the high front unrounded vowel used in English, which is the E-type vowel, and one was a prototype of the U vowel, which is the high front rounded vowel used in Swedish. Then the experimenters played these tokens and synthesized tokens from various closely related values to babies acquiring Swedish and English. And lo and behold, at the age of 6 months, the Swedish babies exhibited a lack of ability to discriminate towards the Swedish prototype, and the English babies displayed the same lack of ability to discriminate towards the English prototype. Neither language group displayed any effect for the foreign contrast. So it appears that we are, by 6 months of age, not only able to distinguish the stop consonants of our native language, but also some of the vowel contrasts. So in a sense, we lose some finesse, we lose some ability to perceive acoustically once we start to use this information for linguistic purposes. There are plenty of other bodies of evidence which point towards this loss of finesse in perception in the first year of life. And it's biologically maybe not that surprising. I mean, there's the famous experiment by Hubel-Wiesel on kittens, which showed that if you close a kitten's eyes for a vital 48 hours of its life, that it will no longer perceive, for the rest of its life, it will never perceive vertical lines. So there are biological moments of opportunity that have to be taken. Now, if you miss them, you've missed them forever. So you can lose out if you don't get the right kind of stimulus, and there's nothing very surprising about the fact that an animal, such as ourselves, acquiring a language, needs to get the stimulus at the right time. And it wouldn't help in our phonetics summer school to just play you endless vowel prototypes of English and see if your production would improve, because it would have no effect. That opportunity is gone. So far we have talked about the ability of very young babies to perceive fine distinctions among phonetic categories, among sound categories. And another significant body of research, which I haven't alluded to yet, exists in the phonetic literature, and this shows that very young children are also able to perceive timing and syllable structure. These things we refer to at least in the courses that I followed as an undergraduate here at UCL, these things we refer to as prosody, as opposed to those things concerned with colour, phonetic colour, the colour of vowels, or the colour in consonants, which we refer to as melody. And this prosody, syllable structure, timing, quantity on the one side is kept fairly separate from melody on the other. And that becomes an important consideration in this investigation. The very young children we're talking about back to 6 months of age now, have also been shown to be sensitive to the prosodic structure of their native language. Jacques Meller in 1988 wrote up some experiments involving 4-month-old children, and what he did with these children was to play them their own native language and foreign languages through a filter, an acoustic filter, which cut out all the high frequencies. Rather like listening through a wall to somebody speaking. You can hear the patterns, the pitch patterns of the language. You can hear none of the segmental information, none of the top end. And it appears from these experiments that the babies could tell quite easily their own native language from foreign languages, from the prosodic contours, all alone without any melodic information. The same thing was demonstrated in independent experiments, which showed that infants seem to be able to discriminate whole syllables consisting of consonant and vowel, but not individual segments. And also that the rhythm pattern, the predominant rhythm pattern of English, which is a trochaic, da-da, 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 could be perceived by infants at 9 months, but not at 6 months. Now all this talent exhibited by the infants at this early age for tuning into prosodic information was taken to indicate that this type of prosodic information was in fact the gateway to eventual phonological acquisition. In other words, the babies get big chunks of things, and they get whole pitch patterns, and then they gradually become sensitive to finer and finer segments until they get down to being able to tell extremely a great deal later the difference between, say, phi and thigh, a fricative distinction of that nature. Now this seems, of course, to contradict all the things I've been telling you about them being able to tell a front-rounded vowel if it's in their own language, and a front-unrounded vowel if it's a native category or a native prototype. But if we impose some phonology on this story, the type of phonology I began to refer to a minute ago, then we can maybe get over this contradiction. Even as adults, the prosody of our language remains independent of the melody of the language and interdependent with the melody of the language. Most common everyday instance of this, the empirical evidence for this, is the existence of Spoonerisms, mistakes of this type. If I was to want to produce this utterance, and instead of saying this, I said, I don't feel like playing. I don't feel like playing. This is a Spoonerism. Now what's happened here apparently is that we've got two phonological words here. This is one phonological word, and this is another phonological word, both consisting of the trochee, feel like playing. And what's happened is that the onset of this word has been swapped around with the onset of this word, showing that the process is quite independent of the melodic colour of the onset. In other words, the actual sound of the p or the f. What's actually swapped over is the content of the syllable, the onset of the syllable. This is a kind of everyday instance of the independence of melody and prosody, and these type of mistakes happen far more often than mistakes of the type where you might say Cassie put for pussycat, which involve, indeed, involve some different components of the syllable being exchanged. But this is by far the most frequent type of mistake like this, and this fits in pretty well with the phonological theory of syllable structure that you would learn if you did a degree here. Let's have a look at two other instances of the independence of prosody and melody to try to convince ourselves that this is we're on the right lines here. There are two quite independent ideas presented on this OHP. Let's bring this down here. The first is a historical change. We can see that the Old English word for which we know as night was actually pronounced nicht. Nicht, and this applied to a whole class of English words. So the word right was pronounced richt, the word wait was pronounced recht. Now, over time, these pronunciations changed to something which we feel much more familiar with. By Middle English, by Modern English, we were listening to the word night, and the word right, and the word wait. Now, this is not just the loss of a fricative, the old velar fricative, which we don't use now in English. It's also there's a lengthening process that's taking place, a compensatory lengthening process, so that we can maintain the amount of structure that we have in the syllable. So if you like, the historical process has attacked the melody and changed it, but it's left the syllable structure completely intact. An independent piece of evidence, and a more modern one, is that within the system proposed by McCarthy in Prince for syllable structure, and many other people as well, in 1986, they were able to account for the fact that, the curious fact that we have no words in English which consist merely of a consonant and a short vowel. So, well, we have plenty of words like see and I. We don't have any words like sap or sit. Now, why should this be? There has to be some sort of linguistic constraint on our language because there's no logical reason why this should be. It's something peculiar to our linguistic knowledge. And they said, well, if you look at the way that the syllable structure of English is actually made, we have empty nuclei at the end of certain words. That's not really within the scope of our discussion this afternoon. But suffice it to say that if you simply say that every English word must be bimeray, must have two nuclear positions, then you can account for all these different realizations. And so this is obviously a condition upon syllable structure and quite independent. If you accept this story, this is quite independent of the melodic inventory of the language, and that's really what why we're referring to it this afternoon. So, having argued our way around various bits of evidence to say that in adulthood we must have, within our linguistic knowledge, we must maintain a certain independence between prosody and melody, we then have to say, well, what's happening to babies? We go back to infancy and we say, well, why should prosody be the gateway to phonological structure? And why can the babies also be demonstrated to have great finesse of perception when it comes to very small segments? And we say, well, it's obvious, because if you've got two systems like this that can slip in adulthood, then they've got to be developed independently. It's not feasible that you would get one lumpen system which was just phonology, and then you'd be able to split apart the knowledge at a later stage into two entirely discrete systems, one to do with structure and one to do with colour. These things may be acquired, now this is speculative, I admit, but these things, it seems to me, may be acquired independently and put together at a later date, maybe towards 1 year of age, when the child starts to produce actual utterances, babbling of that type. So we've seen, we're coming on to section 4 now on your handout, we've seen that at least arguably, if we import a bit of phonological theory into these phonetic puzzles, we might be able to shed some light on some of the acquisitional perceptual stories. It also falls on us as a responsibility to try to look for empirical evidence that may allow us to characterize perception in infancy of various linguistic categories and prototypes as phonological and not purely as acoustic or phonetic. And what kind of empirical evidence can we look for? Well, I've given you two suggestions under section 4, and what I've said is, if I could just read these out, it's probably the simplest thing. This is section 4b, Roman number 1. And I said that if the same acquisitional root exists for the development of two parameters that are phonetically dissimilar, but successfully analysed as reflexes of the same phonological prime, then this may constitute positive evidence. So, if our phonetics can measure two things which are quite different, but we can see that they do the same job in language, that they do the same phonological job, and if we can then see that there is a parallel in the acquisition of perception of these two phonetically dissimilar objects, then we have got some evidence, some possible evidence to say that we're actually looking at a phonological acquisition here, not purely phonetic acquisition. The second suggestion is that as long as we can eliminate, this is under section 4b2, as long as we can eliminate the effects of different perceptual strategies, in other words, as long as we're clear about whether we're talking about categorical perception, prototypical perception, which are evidently different psychological routines, there's no reason why one phonetic class should be acquired later than another. But if we can see a time lag in acquisition, where the mode of perception remains the same, and if we can see that the first phonetic class is predicted as phonologically more simple than the second, then we've also got some positive evidence to at least support our assertion that, in fact, in the first year of life, babies are getting some phonology. Now, what I'm trying to do at the moment is to, in terms of my research, is to try to use the acquisition of two different areas of language to support both of these possibilities. And under section 5, I talk about the first one. I think on my handout I've got two section 5s actually. So under section 5, I've got the acquisition of laryngeal contrast, which is the first possibility. And the second section 5, on the next page, it should be section 6, I've got the acquisition of vowel colour. Sorry about that. So let's begin with the acquisition of laryngeal contrast. What I mean by laryngeal contrast is the acquisition of tone, and that's the acquisition of lexical tone in languages which use tone to distinguish meaning, and also the acquisition of voicing contrasts in stops. At this stage, we need to bring together some facts and theories from some independent areas of research. First, we backtrack a little to section 2, where we talked about the acquisition of phonation contrast, in other words, the acquisition of ha-ba or g, and we saw that the acquisition of the Spanish contrast seemed to need some linguistic reinforcement. Got the English babies at 6 months couldn't hear the Spanish contrast, whereas the acquisition of the English type contrast didn't seem to need any linguistic reinforcement. The English ha-ba seemed to be there from birth. The perception, therefore, of the English contrast by the Spanish children doesn't necessarily need to be anything to do with language. It could just be that language elects to use some mammalian perceptions that we are given, and indeed chinchillas are given, sometimes, and at other times, a particular language is free to ignore this kind of thing and free to just get on with acquiring sensitivity to the language pool in which it finds itself. Now we need to discuss briefly a little phonological theory, a little of the phonological theory that is currently bandied around these parts. And when we discuss the analysis of melody, the analysis of colour, phonologically, at least some of us in the department here, both among the postgraduates like myself and among the staff, believe that melody can be best analysed into a series of elements, rather than a series of phonemes, or indeed a series of features, such as the SPE type Chomskyan features. The basic theory of elements is extremely simple, and in fact much more simple than feature theory. But before I just mention that, I ought to perhaps mention in passing that if everything that I've said about the independence of melody and prosody, and about the perceptual talents of babies, and about the types of routines that we use, won't go through if we believe in phonemes. Once you start to believe in phonemes as psychologically real, as opposed to merely convenience for learning a language like English, which has got a very illogical spelling system, once you start to think of phonemes as something which are really in there, that we really use in perception, then all of this falls apart. So really we need to think in terms of phonological elements for these theories to even hang together at all. Now what I mean by that is that underlying, for instance, vowel colour, there are three elements only, three peripheral elements. These are kind of a holy trinity of elements. There's E, R, U, and these are combinable. Now, there's plenty of language typological evidence which supports this, since these show up in so many languages. There is not a language in the world without an E sound, for instance. R seems to be the quintessential vowel that is acquired first in life, and that is the maximally contrasting vowel with consonants, with stop consonants. There's all sorts of evidence. The 25% of the world's languages use a vowel system which consists only of 5 vowels of this type, which we can very easily account for as combinations of these three. And that's really the key to how we will get the various colours in a vowel colours used in a language from 3 simple elements that we begin with. If we have a realization of this sort on the surface, an E vowel is simply a simple realization of a phonological E element. This is this fella here. And if we have an R-type phonetic realization, then that would be an interpretation of an underlying phonological element R. If we put these two together, because what we've got to crucially argue here is that these are combinable, then we're going to end up with a mid-vowel which shares properties of both, and this is simply a combination of 2 underlying elements. Now, once we the actual inventory of elements is fairly how many we've got altogether to account for all linguistic contrasts is fairly controversial, but it's certainly something which has been discussed pretty widely recently among phonologists, and it is said that we can, with a comparatively small amount of these, maybe as little as 5, maybe as many as 9, we can account for all linguistic melodic contrasts. The story when it comes to phonation is that underlying the Spanish fully voiced stop is an element which we represent with a large L. And underlying the English aspirated stop is an element that we represent with a large H. And underlying the so-called voiceless stop in Spanish and the so-called voice stop in English, which are in fact phonetically almost identical, there is no element, there's no phonological element, there's nothing that can participate in phonological processes. There's quite a lot of good empirical evidence for, at least for the fact that this is an inert object, this is just a stop, and that this has got some active element underlying it, as has this. Processes such as spreading take place in a language like voicing assimilation and spreading take place in a language like Spanish quite freely. French and Greek are the same. They don't take place from the so-called voice stops in English. And so we can see that there's something here that's active in a process. So we might in French get, if we get the word avec up against the word vous, then we will get, we can optionally get a realization avec vous, with some spreading and voicing from the following voiced segment. This never happens in accents of English in exactly the same, well, said to be the same phonetic environment. If you get two English words like black van, you will never get black van, because there's nothing really active phonologically to spread in the so-called English voiced fricative. So there is some evidence that we can at least say that there's something active here, and not much going on in the middle. There are plenty of languages, though, that if they use, we've already mentioned Spanish, Greek, and French. There are plenty of other languages that if they choose to use this contrast as opposed to this contrast. So there's the Spanish, Greek, French. There's also Hungarian. What else? Dutch does this as well. So they're not necessarily. Hungarian, as you know, is from a very different language family. So it's not just a very close-knit group of languages that do this. It seems to be a feature which crosses linguistic history. The important point from the phonological theoretical point from our point of view is that these elements, L and H, which are said to underline these phonetic contrasts, are also said to be active in this system in lexical tone. So it's said that in a high tone that you will get an H underlying, a phonological H underlying a high tone word, then in a mid-tone word there will be no phonological laryngeal element. In a low-tone word you'll get an L underlying. So if we go to a language like Yoruba, where we can have minimal triplets of the sort of, if anybody speaks Yoruba, I apologize for my accent, but if you can get words of the sort ki, ki, and ki. And the first means thick, the second means greet, and the third means praise. So they're entirely lexically discrete items, and they're distinguished only from the tonal point of view. Now, surely with this argument that our phonology says that there's some sort of acquisitional routine that we can spot the symmetries in here for the acquisition of the English and Spanish onsets, and we can see that the same elements also operate in lexical tone, that we can do some experiments on lexical tone acquisition to see if the same kind of routine exists. And if we could see that, then we've got at least some insight into the acquisition of phonetically dissimilar things that are phonologically analysed as the same item. I've carried out some tests on Yoruba native speakers, adults, and also used an English control to see if we might argue our way successfully through this conundrum. And one of the results, which came up, has been graphed here. I'll just show you this briefly. We know that in the perception of pitch, the simple perception of acoustic pitch, that the organism, the human organism, can perceive as different anything that is further apart, immeasurably further apart in hertz, than about 4 hertz. 4 or 5 hertz seems to be about the cut-off point. If it's any closer than that, we think it's the same. And for the English speaker listening to Yoruba words, that obtained completely. The English speaker heard everything that was closer than 5 hertz as the same and everything further apart as different. This is pure acoustic perception. However, when I played these words to a Yoruba speaker, we got a different result. It took at least 25 hertz differential before the Yoruba speaker was happy about these being different objects. Somewhere in there was a definite tendency to coarsen off the perception of pitch, so that things which were physically further apart sounded like the same thing. Another weird result is that I was playing words in isolation, which was these 3 words I mentioned, keep, key, and keep. Is that in isolation, there seemed to be no perception of low tone whatsoever. There was perception of the difference between high and mid-tone quite reliably, but low tone didn't really show at all in any of the circumstances. But maybe that's a story for another day. Since we want to stick to the point of this discussion, which is how can we use this information to test children? Well, if we can test children, this I suggest is on the section D, on section 5D on your handout. If we test children at the age of 6 months acquiring an HL tone language such as Yoruba, then we should see the development of prototypes of some sort in the pitch range, but probably only for the H prototype, which would accord with the results of the adult tests. And if we can see this, if we can see the development of this kind of a prototype, then we've got some evidence for the phonological significance of the prime, and we've also got a parallel between adult and infant mentation. Now, the bit that I, because of the pressures of time that I've missed out of this argument, which I should maybe just go back and briefly mention, is that phonological analyses of the languages of South Africa have come up with these languages being successfully analysed as using H tone only, so high tone only. Phonological analyses of the languages of West Africa, such as Yoruba, use H and L, according to the phonological stories. But there isn't a single language anywhere that's been analysed as using L only. So this little piece of evidence also concords with our prediction that probably that the perception of L tone, or at least feasibly the perception of L tone, is something to do with prosody, not to do with a melodic prime. We have 5 minutes left, and I do want to mention the acquisition, the other strand of this argument, which is the acquisition of vowel colour. Now, we said that at least in a list of 317 languages that exists in the library here, that 25% of them have a vowel system of this nature. And if you add just a little central vowel to this system, then you get maybe another 6 or so % of the languages. However, if you want to expand this vowel inventory a little bit further and say, let's have 7 vowels, then you get many fewer languages using this system. So there's some bias on the part of languages typologically to use 5 vowel systems. And the contrast that seems to be marked is this mid-contrast between the mid-vowels. Furthermore, if you get a 5-vowel system, that's the one without the mid-vowel contrast, this one, then the lower of the vowels tends to show up. If we just concentrate on the front vowels for a minute, the lower of the 2 front vowels, these 2, tends to show up more frequently than the higher one does. Now this accords rather neatly with the phonological account of vowel colour that fits into the system that I've briefly been discussing. In any of these accounts of phonology, the analysis of this chap is that it is less complex than this one here. This involves the activation of something else, or else the addition of something to this pre-existing category. So what we want to look at now is pretty obvious. We want to find a language which has got 7 vowels, get the children, test the children, and see if we can see a time lag in the acquisition of these two. And happily for phonology, a language like this exists not quite as far away as West Africa. There is, happily for English phonology that is, because it means that the plane fares don't cost quite so much. And if you go to north-east Spain, you can hear plenty of people who use this language. The Catalan language fits into this pattern perfectly. So you get minimal pairs of the sort of te and te. These are 2 Catalan words. And so we can clearly use this happy fact to test Catalan acquiring babies to see if we can discern a time lag in the acquisition of these prototypes. Let's have a quick look at our stars again, stars of the show. And just trying to remind ourselves what we're doing here. What we're trying to do is say that somewhere in this fella's brain there's something that we all start out with. And if we are actually not shaped like this, but shaped like this, that by the time we get to 6 months of age, that we sorted some of this perceptual talent out, some of these perceptual talents into something that makes linguistic sense. And if we steer clear of phonemes, to which are attached the idea of meaning, and say that what we have as a phonological system is really a pattern recognition system, which, like this kind of, recognize a pattern, 2 different patterns that you can combine, that we can say that at 6 months of age that we have actually got some kind of phonology, not merely some phonetic distinctions which later become phonology when we get meaning. I realise that the end product of all this is to say, well, have you got any phonetics left at all? Because maybe all you've got is a psychoacoustic prejudice, which is given by the organism, and then you impose your phonology, the phonology of your native language on that. And I'd say, well, maybe that's right. Maybe what we're going to end up with is not necessarily no phonetics. It doesn't really matter whether you call it phonetics or phonology, but we're going to end up with an easier system to comprehend, whereby the linguistic pattern recognition system merely attunes mammalian perception. I have to finally apologise for the lack of results that I've presented to you, but I hope if you are interested enough to come back to the course next year, that I might be able to give you something harder to get your teeth into. Thank you very much.